Hello and welcome to the Wild Wonder podcast, where we seek to democratize and demystify holistic wellness practices by speaking with today's leading practitioners. Today is return guest and friend of the podcast, Sophia Hornyak of Divine Void Sophia, who is a channeler, explorer of the Akasha, and conduit. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be back.
So happy to see your smiling face. We were actually supposed to do this podcast, I want to say about 2 months ago. I just want to backtrack a little. And you reached out and you're like, everything has changed. And I felt like I was in the same space. I was like, thank God you said that because everything has changed for me. Um, so I think a lot of us during that time made like a sharp right turn. What did that feel like for you?
Totally. So it's funny because it feels like sudden, right? Like the
Hmm.
sharp right turn, but there's also a level of it that's like if retrospectively that this has been progressing in this way. Um, so, in my own experience, looking back at it now, maybe a year and a half ago when I was on the podcast the last time,
Hmm.
I felt like my life was starting to mold in a
Hmm.
certain way, but I didn't know what that meant, right?
Right.
Like, I feel like a lot of us are on the precipice of
Hmm.
something, and we were just hoping, at least, those that are listening and, in
Yes.
that spiritual lifestyle, I think we were all just kind of on the precipice of this change. And of course, with the pandemic, I think that on a macrocosmic scale, there was a forced shift that we all
Hmm.
had to adhere to. Um, so, even though I knew I was on this precipice and I knew I was following the breadcrumbs, I really didn't know what that meant,
Right.
right? You're just walking in faith. You're just moving in faith and you're just listening to the science and trying to be open and continuing on the best you can. And then it's like all the little puzzle pieces that you found on the way just click. And even though I feel that everything has changed for me and my practice and who I
Hmm.
am and how I represent myself and how I show up, I still know that this is just another scene in
Hmm.
that play. So as I'm in this new space, I know there's new puzzle pieces that are going to click even more. But I do feel like it has clicked.
Right.
I do feel somewhat more whole
Hmm.
rather than putting the pieces together.
And you're talking about following the breadcrumbs and having faith, but having faith is tough when you're trying to find the breadcrumbs. I think we are like when we come full circle, we're like, yeah, of course it was supposed to end up like this. But can you describe kind of the feelings of how you were able to hold that space? Because the in between is kind of the hardest part. If sometimes for a lot of us, we don't want to be in the in between and we just jump straight to the next thing. How were you able to hold that, have that container for yourself?
Well, first off, it wasn't easy.
Yeah.
Like, you know, um, during that time too, in my personal life, again, we have the pandemic and I had just had a baby and
Hmm.
we had just moved and, had to hire a lawyer, because we were being bullied and stalked and threatened by this old realtor. And, there's all these crazy pieces and it was kind of like, it was so chaotic. I had no other option,
Hmm.
right? And I definitely come from um the school of especially with working with shadow, understanding that when these quote bad things happen, there's a bigger piece to it.
Hmm.
There's something more I'm supposed to learn. And I think having that ingrained in me, um, I'm kind of comfortable in chaos, right?
Hmm.
So all of this chaos is happening. I understand that things are shifting. Now, not everyone understands that. Um, but there are moments where you have doubts. There are moments where you're like, this isn't working, or the big one is, am I just crazy?
Yeah.
Am I just insane? Right? Um, but then I feel every moment that I wanted to give up, every moment that I felt like I'm going crazy, there would be something so otherworldly, so it's like, when you're tripping on acid and you're like, there's no way that happened in real life.
Right.
It's like those moments, right? So I'd be like, I'm done. I don't know. Like, this isn't working. Maybe I'm crazy. And then like some crazy sign would come through. And I think that ultimately that faith is your light, that candle, right? And so, like, all these doubts, all of these social pressures, all of these, algorithms and things that we feel like that we are working with, if you're working in that faith, like, why, when they're showing themselves to you, why wouldn't you just keep going to see where that is? And ultimately, in life, if you don't take chances, you're not going to get far. You're just going to do the same thing over and over again. And that's just not me personally.
Right.
I don't like redundancy. So I feel that the more problematic, the more I felt like I hit the ground, or I like hit a low, the higher, or like that high would come through again, that lightning bolt would come through. And I think that when you have that over and over again, it's kind of hard not to have faith.
Mm-hmm.
Something that my guides told me is that faith is universal, but singular truth is not. So in the moments that you're in, whatever truth you have, and we talk about this in bhakti, you're looking through a mirror or you're looking through a window, and if you're feeling dirty and gross inside, your window is going to be dirty and gross. Your
Right.
truth isn't really universal, it's just your singular truth, but that faith is universal. So keeping that in mind, I think it helps to clean that window, that outlook.
How do you clean your window? Because I know we all have our different tools.
Yeah. In my personal practice, I study a lot of the Western mysteries tradition, which is mystical Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, Enochian, Solomonic magic, ceremonial magic. But at the core of my practice is bhakti, which is yoga of devotion. So being heart-centered is really important. And I worked hard to get there because like, life is really tough, and we all go through our hurdles and our battles, and sometimes it's hard not to feel jaded or hoarse or covered or protective of yourself. But in those moments, I remind myself to come from a place of love and nurturing, and continuing to evolve that, because when I'm doing it to the outside world, I'm doing it to the inside world, right? And so I find that constant practice of going, okay, hold on, like, yes, this sucks, but this person's doing the best they can. I'm doing the best I can. This is not a personal affront, like, really. And it's a practice. It's not something inherent. So really making that practice and softening my judgment on myself and others, like, I feel like that really helps clean that window.
Are there physical rituals that accompany that help remind you of that practice?
The biggest one is when I have a lot on my plate, remembering to rest.
Oh, yeah.
That is the most important ritual. Like, I do practice ceremonial magic, but ultimately that's what it is, like taking a step back before I burn out. Because as much as, my altar is a big part of my work, my room is a big part of my work, my physical life, my actionable life is the ritual itself. So I'm a mom, and I own a business, and I have a family, and, trying to take the 10 minutes or 20 minutes to meditate or to channel or to do the practice. Like, yeah, I make that time, but
Hmm.
making time for yourself to just turn off
Yeah.
is very important.
It's so important. And it's a practice, if we're talking about bhakti, it's a practice of the ultimate self-compassion, right?
Absolutely. Oh yeah,
Um,
for sure.
yeah. So going back to this last precipice, you're standing at the edge of this precipice. I would like you to talk us through what your work was leading up to here before this last shift.
Sure. So, I I'm a psychic medium, and I do communicate with my guides, my guardians, whoever,
Hmm.
constantly, all the time. And it's not just being in meditation and channeling. I really have learned, and I'm very blessed to have come in a family that taught me how to learn how nature speaks to you. So the subtle energies in life, it's synchronicities, right?
Right.
Um, and so there's a time in my life, maybe about 2 years ago, where it was just so intense. I knew that there was something going on, and it led me to the Akashic records, which I'd been familiar with in my teens, and I started practicing around other Akashic practitioners. And every time I got a reading and every time I channeled, the same message would come through. And it was like, you are supposed to pull down a new modality. You are supposed to start a curriculum. You're supposed to do all this stuff. And right, and supposed to kind of feels like expectation. So I'm like,
Right.
I don't know. What does that mean? Who am I? What am I supposed to teach? And,
Mm.
and there was like a moment where I realized that as Divine Void, and at the time it was Divine Void Botanica, I was really trying to show up as what other people wanted, what would catch attention. And, I think it's natural for us as human beings to see a formula of success and say, okay, I need to follow that formula. But then there was a moment where I started feeling like I'm not aligned. Like this isn't who I
Right.
am. I don't want to do these kind of readings. I don't want to do all of this stuff. And I don't want to follow the mold because that's not who I've ever been.
Mm.
I've always been the one that's like, I want to do what you tell me not to do. Like
Right.
that's
I'm there with you.
yeah, like I was a very challenging person to manage when I worked in the corporate world. But so I kept following this and I kept hearing things like, oh, you're gonna work with angels and you're gonna do this and you're gonna do that. So I kept trying to force it. I kept trying to, say, okay, I'm gonna look up angels and I'm going to look up this and I'm going to try to create it, but it just wasn't working. And so
Hmm.
I surrendered. I just stopped. And what I did was I took away readings.
Hmm.
Because when you're in the Akashic records, there is a very specific energy. There's a specific sound, feeling. And I realized that when I was channeling, I was not there anymore.
Hmm.
And so I couldn't in good conscience say, okay, I'm going to charge people for an Akashic Records reading when I'm not in the records anymore, when I'm
Hmm.
not resonating with that frequency at this time. And that was hard.
Hmm.
Um, because obviously that is the bulk of my income. But while I had that space, I started really, that's when things started shifting. That's when things started
Hmm.
moving. I started to get more into who I was,
Hmm.
who I am as a practitioner, what I am looking for, what I'm doing. And all I had was that nugget that you're supposed to bring down this new modality. You're supposed to speak and create a school and create this curriculum. And I all I could do in that time is surrender to whatever was coming through and just
Hmm.
follow it. And what I realized is in all of the messages and channelings that I would get, I would feel really close and then sharp turn. And
Right.
it would keep happening.
Right.
Um, it really started around the time I lost my grandmother, who is she was my mother, and she was also a magical practitioner. And I saw a post from, I don't remember what it was, but it was an Egyptian steel. And I just thought that was really cool. It was like something about this city, this ancient city was lost to the sea, and they found all of these seals and statues and whatnot. And so when I drove down to Virginia to say my final goodbye to my grandmother, um, that same hidden city,
Mm.
there was an exhibit at a museum. And I
Oh,
was like,
wow.
okay, like there was a reason I have to go check this out. When I went there, there wasn't this huge feeling of, oh, this is familiar. Oh, I'm getting like, it wasn't like that, but it was kind of like, oh, yeah, like, of course, there was an
Mm.
of course feeling. Um, and after that, I started dreaming in Hebrew. I don't speak
Mm.
Hebrew. So I started writing everything down, and I started keeping notes of every dream and channel that I had for the last year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back at it, I started to piece everything together. So I just went on this crazy, like, fox hunt. Um, and that's what the precipice was just pushing me and forcing me to surrender,
Mm.
to just let it happen versus forcing it to happen, right? Because you say, like,
Right.
we get so caught up in the future, um, we almost want to will it to happen, but
Yeah.
that's not really up to us. It's up to us to say, like, am I going to follow? Am I
Especially with
going?
the financial piece, especially when your
Oh my
spiritual
gosh.
practice is tied to the finances, because you're like, okay, great, I'll follow, I'll let go, but I have to pay the electric bill, you know?
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because during that time when I got rid of that piece, um, all of a sudden we sold our house,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden we bought a house, and we didn't have cash to do that, but my husband, like, little things like my husband did some kind of, like, I don't know, NFT baseball card thing, and
Hmm.
he hit, and we sold one for $4,000.
Oh, wow.
And all of a sudden we had like an extra 10,000 that came to, like, there was just weird, interesting things that were happening for money. And it was kind of like I know that I know what this is. Like, I know
Right.
that I'm working on another frequency. This isn't, I can't be so worried about it. Um, and I had the dream when my grandmother passed that she was like, look, my grandmother was really poor. We grew up in poverty, and she was like, you're gonna get a new house. This is your inheritance. And I was kind of like, I don't know how this is gonna happen. And so when it started to happen, I was like, oh, this is why it's happening. And I've learned over time that as long as I am moving in faith, stuff comes through. Like, we'll always get like a random check or a random whatever, or our insurance got messed up and now we're owed $1,000. Like, things like that was happening. And so that helped me continue the faith
Hmm.
that, like, look, I'm doing the right thing. Look, I'm taking a big chance. And I mean, outside of that, it's still hard your day to day, but it's those moments, like, that I
Yeah.
said, like, that happen that, like, makes you, okay, yes, I'm on the right track. I'm doing the right thing.
Yeah, because it's so hard when like it feels like the outside world is acting on you, and then your nerves are wired, right? Like when you're like looking for money, or when you get sued, or when all these a pandemic and war and all these things, and you're like, how do I trust and let go and open my heart and move in faith?
Yeah.
I think that's the toughest part.
Yeah, totally. And I think that when we're talking about compassion and surrendering, one of the biggest things that happened to me was the birth of my daughter. When I gave birth, she stopped breathing. And there was two dreams right before she was born where one where I was screaming at the doctors and nurses, and I was like, she's not breathing, she's turning blue, you're not doing anything. And then I had another dream where they said, pray to Archangel Michael and Archangel Gabriel. And so when that happened, I'll never forget, I was holding her. We just got moved into the room and we had these huge windows and birds and dragonflies were hitting the window over and over again. Like it was so crazy. Like my husband was like, "What? This is insane." And all of a sudden I had a panic attack, a severe, so bad that I thought I was going to drop her. So he took her, and at that moment, a nurse came in and she said, "Hey, like, do you want us to take the baby to the nursery so you can get some sleep?" Now, I wasn't planning on doing that, but because I was panicking, I did. And
Mm.
we really lucked out because that panic attack saved her because she turned purple in the nursery. If we had fallen asleep, she would have died.
Right.
And so she was in the NICU for 10 days, and I had to reach out and ask people for help and ask people to pray and ask people for whatever it was that they could. And when we finally got her home, I opened myself up to receiving help. And I'm, a highly independent person. I'm
Mm.
one of those, I had surgery and like didn't tell anybody. Like I'm
Right.
one of those. I'm very private. And it really helped me open up to receiving.
Hmm.
And I think that that was what helped move me into this bigger piece of surrendering and receiving.
Prior to that, had you had any connection to the worlds of the angels or angels in particular?
When I was really young, I remember I had dreams about Saint Augustine
Hmm.
and Archangel Michael, and but I wasn't raised Christian or
Mm.
anything, so like I didn't really know what that meant, and I didn't really know. I didn't know, and
Right.
I always had this like weird memory of like the War of Angels, and I would talk to my grandmother about it, and she was like, "I don't know what you're talking about," and I would ask people, and nobody knew what I was talking
Because
about.
what background is your grandmother that you're asking?
My grandmother is a root worker, so she practiced folk magic.
Mm.
And she was really into plants, really into talking to ghosts. So our family, we practiced that, and so it was kind of like, quote, one person per generation
Mhm.
would be chosen. So her grandmother taught her, and then my grandmother taught me.
Mhm. But there's no
Um,
connection to Christianity in that
None.
family line.
No, which is crazy because we grew up in the South where there was like more churches than there were gas stations in our
Oh,
town.
I know.
But
I'm in it.
yeah, right. So like, but my grandmother never went, and I didn't understand, and
Right.
she was like, God is in nature. God is not
Mm.
in a building.
Mm.
So I really didn't understand what that meant, and even other practitioners that I knew, um, I would ask them like, "Do you know anything about the War of the Angels? Do you know anything?" Like, and nobody said anything. When right before I got pregnant with my daughter, I remember waking up because I was hearing bells, and I was like in between, hypnagogic, like in between sleep and awake,
Mhm.
and I saw this being, but it was just so intense. I told them to stop because my heart felt like it was going to explode,
Mm.
and there was like a knowing that this was Gabriel, and then like not even a month later I got pregnant. So that was like
Wow.
the most intense feeling I got from an angel.
Mhm.
And you know uh, it, all of this has become more of a recent development with the angels, but
How,
I'm assuming this has always been in my field.
right. About how recent would you say? Like the last few months?
I would say in the past like year and a half, 2 years,
Okay.
that it's since the birth of my daughter, it has continued to intensify.
Okay. So we're back at the precipice. You've been
Yes.
doing shadow work and you've had these visions and dreams and you've been working with angels for the last year and a half. What begins to happen now?
So, I took a Akashic, or I have been taking an Akashic Records uh, teaching course, and it ends in April.
Mhm.
And I knew this was something I wanted to do, and I took this with Helen Vonderheide, who is an Akashic Records leader, in the community. And her whole thing was veering off of Linda Howe's grip on the Akashic records. I feel the records have become almost like a place. So people kind of identify this is a library that holds all the records, and it's almost become almost as casual as like Reiki. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there are some Reiki practitioners where you're like, whoa, this is real. And then there's some people that take it and you're like, oh, okay. The and I just kind of feel like, I don't know if this is the correct way of saying this, but I'm just going to say it. It's almost like this idea of the Akashic records have been like colonized. We're all settling in. And coming from the yoga background, I understand Akasha as, the etheric field, this higher field, sort of like in, Kabbalistic studies, you have like Ein Sof, or like that's how I understand it. It's a field of energy. And I think it's more than this one place. And if you, look into things like revelations and, Gnostic practices, they say everyone says something different, but, there's 36 layers of heavens, or there's 5 layers of heaven. So there's layers to this. There's layers to this frequency. So when I took her class, I told her, like, look, I'm not in the records. I don't want to do this as like the Akashic Records teacher training. And she's like really big on whatever is true to your frequency, go for it. And it allowed me to attune and harmonize to what was trying to and at my field, and accept it. And as I took this class, the signs and the symbols and everything intensified. All of my channelings, I started to audibly hear, and physically smell, and it just became more and more apparent. So again, I'm in this place of surrendering. So I'm like, let's navigate through this. So I'm taking this training. I'm also, studying and practicing Kabbalah, gematria. I'm looking more into ceremonial magic. And
so at this point, you're reading again.
Yes, I think I started reading maybe about a few months ago. So yeah, I would say this is in the past like year.
Okay.
And what I started pulling in different forms of energy work that they wanted me to work with and to help people with. And so I released those. So that was like vectorization and harmonization. And I think that was still kind of over a lot of people's heads, which is fine, and as I kind of got into this practice, it seemed like all these things I was studying and gravitating towards. So, all of the Western mystery stuff, all of my own channelings, this Akashic work, everything that I was reading through the Red Book by Carl Jung, everything that I was reading through Edgar Cayce, everything that I was reading through Allan Kardec was starting to kind of pull in, and I was starting to see kind of like bridges, right? Because like these things are written in different time periods away from each other. And so the biggest thing that I learned is language. I think there's like in the Medium book by Allan Kardec, there's a line where one of the spirits say something to the effect of like, you humans fight over language so much. Like, how do you think you're going to speak to us? You take everything so literal. And that's true, right? And so I'm looking at these different things that are channeled through Edgar Cayce, the things that are coming in through the Red Book. I'm looking at the Lesser and Greater Keys of Solomon and John Dee's Enochian Legonath, the book that he wrote. And I'm realizing there's parts of it that they just lacked the language for and
Mm-hmm.
didn't really come through till later. And so I started to layer what this stuff meant after, years or centuries of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized is that everyone had this common thing going on, a common practice, a common way of achieving it, but they were just in different time periods.
Right.
And it's funny. I was channeling the one day, and I was like, I said something like, "What does it mean to me to be sovereign?" And they laughed and they said, "Sophia, your obsession with royal history, like we're not understanding why you can't see why this is so important."
Mm.
And it clicked. Like my obsession with history is why I read all of these books and why
Mm-hmm.
I'm very interested, and the royalty is that ultimately like our lives, our field, our being is our kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
how we rule our kingdom. And that's all anybody was looking for. How do we understand and resolve
Mm-hmm.
our kingdom out without the outside forces of other kingdoms? So
Right.
I thought that was really truly interesting, and things started to kind of again like line up in the
Mm-hmm.
puzzle. But it wasn't until I had my recent panic attack with my daughter, I took some time with that. Um, I was really, really scared, and it was the most furthest away from quote sanity I'd ever felt. And
Mm-hmm.
my mother suffers from multiple personalities and schizophrenia. And so I grew up with that, and it's a terrifying thing to grow up with. And
Mm-hmm.
being sane has always, quote, sane has always been very
Right.
important to me. So when I veered so far off, I got really nervous about it. I took time alone again. And what I realized was I had a very complicated relationship with my biological mother because she gave me up when I was young. And I never
Mm-hmm.
understood why she couldn't get it together, why she left me. And I felt my whole life like I wasn't accepted, like I wasn't loved, like all of the things that you try to reparent yourself to,
Mm-hmm.
why I couldn't trust anybody, my fear of abandonment, um, my sense of not belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And it dawned on me that in the 80s, my mother suffered from postpartum, and she didn't have a support system, and mental health wasn't as important. And so what she did was she gave me up out of love, because in that
Mm-hmm.
moment that I had that panic attack, I would have done anything to make sure Esme was safe.
Right.
And the moment that I realized that I had to be in her shoes, it it took away a lifetime of burden, a lifetime of hurt, and a lifetime of feeling like I wasn't good enough, feeling like I wasn't loved, feeling like I didn't belong, feeling like I wasn't important. And it gave me so much compassion for her and also for myself as a young mother, because my son, I had him when I was 19.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I realized that, it was like a lightning bolt. When I released all of that, it was like something had to take the place. It's like when we
Mm-hmm.
sage or we clear a space, we put good smells back in, we put good energy back
Mm-hmm.
in. It was like this lightning bolt came through, and that's where it brought me to this work. And I remember saying, like, who is here? And they said, the monarchs. Now, I had never heard of any angelic choirs. I even looked it up. I was like, what are the different ones? What could like connect? Maybe it's a language thing. Never heard of any of that. And once I started to, when I grabbed that and started to roll with it, is
Mm-hmm.
when this new work started to develop. And it really gave me a true understanding of like, you know, um, I do have something to offer, and I am loved, and I am supported, and I'm never alone.
Mm-hmm.
And the practice of the last year of figuring out who I am, what I have to offer, who matters was a very important part of absorbing what needed to come through.
It's such an important lesson, I think, for all of us. Like if we're able to physically give ourselves that space and then to have the strength and the faith to really like sit through it, which sometimes is the toughest part, so many miracles and breakthroughs can happen as they've happened for you. I know I'm in a period in time where I'm like, if somebody will just tell me what to do, I will do it, while simultaneously knowing that whatever somebody tells me to do, I'm going to do the opposite. So
Yeah.
it's a fun place to be. But I do pray that more people take the space and that I take more space to be able to hold that great compassion for myself.
Totally. I think that, like, there are so many times in the past 2 years where I was like, just tell me what it is,
Right.
right? Or I have clients that are like, why can't I know right now? Well, I mean, there's a process to everything. It's like the 76ers, trust the process.
Right.
It's not about the destination.
Mhm.
It's about the journey. There's such a process through that, that you talk about like the hero's journey or
Mhm.
Jesus's journey, or it's always the journey itself that um, cultivates the wisdom. So if
Right.
I had known what I know now 2 years ago, it wouldn't be the same because I wouldn't truly understand and have been saturated in the practice of it.
Right. Exactly. So your role now through your work, you describe it as empowering one's own sovereignty.
Yes.
So how would you describe that?
So I think that, I worked in sales and marketing for a
Mm.
really long time before I decided to take this practice. And something I noticed in the wellness world or the
Mhm.
spiritual world is there's, buzzwords, right? There's, I saw sovereignty being thrown all over the place, right? Then I thought, like, what does that really mean, though? Like, what is the definition of that? And
Mm.
in anything that somebody is offering, are you truly teaching somebody how to do that? Or are you saying it to A, sound good, or
Mm.
B, you're not even sure of
Right.
what it is, what that truly means. You just know you're supposed to, right?
Mm.
Like that comes down to the formulation. We're supposed to be sovereign. Well,
Right.
what does that truly mean? Does that mean like I'm supposed to be myself? Does that mean that I'm supposed to, what does it mean? Right?
Mm.
So, um, and that goes back to my channeling. I was like, what does that mean for me to be sovereign? And they're like, Sophia, your obsession with royalty. And I'm like, I still don't get it. And so I started like watching, I love, timepieces. I started watching a bunch of timepieces and I'd go in these like Wikipedia holes and I, I, I realized something that was pretty interesting. Something that's always said about these royal beings is that they are appointed by God. And, but they have a kingdom to rule. And so the ones that feel entitled to it suffer and struggle.
Mm.
But the ones that actually seep into the dirt and seep into the wars and seep themselves into the structures of their kingdom can truly understand how it operates and how it works. There's times to be strong, there's times to be merciful, and that has a lot to do with being a true and tied leader. And regardless if you're, quote, appointed by God, you can be either or.
Mm.
One thing that I always see in all of my studies is that we are divine within ourselves, whether we are, molded in the image of God, or if we hold that divinity within, or we are a piece and we need to remember, whatever it is, we have a part of it. We have it.
Mhm.
So I connected that, like, if we are appointed by God, if we have this piece of God, it's ultimately like, how do we navigate holding down our kingdom? Because you can have a lot of guides and scholars and people around telling you what to do, but it's ultimately up to your discernment. How
Mhm.
do you figure it out. And the only way you can do that is to navigate it yourself. And so something that I've noticed coming back onto social media, I'm seeing a lot more curriculum or classes that are quote attuning you to yourself or attuning you to the Akashic records or attuning you to whatever. And I think this is amazing, right? Because I think that we are in a turning point in the world where collectively we are saying, yes, we recognize this. We want to connect. We want to reconnect again. And there's a great remembering that everyone's talking about. And from what my guides have told me, or, whoever's talking to me told me, is that there is an ushering of lots of information. And so microcosmically, we can see this in technologies. There's major shifts in technologies, and that is just reflective of what's happening in the universe. But they want more collaboration from us. And I think a lot of people think that whatever spirit says or what is out there, we're either supposed to follow or we're supposed to do, but ultimately, again, we're appointed by God. We have this divinity, so we can collaborate. We can say yes or no. We can say this works for me, this doesn't work for me.
Right.
And I think that is what is truly sovereign, understanding how to listen to the information, absorb what works for you, park what's in the back for later, maybe navigating your own system and collaborating with the larger forces. That's what I feel is truly sovereign, because ultimately your decisions, understanding whether they're wrong or right, there is no wrong or right.
When you say appointed by God, going back to the word appointment, do you believe that a greater being, greater than ourselves, gives us an appointment, something to do, or does it get he, she, it's they, give us an appointment at any given time, and then it is up to our discernment and our desire to either take on that appointment or not?
So first off, to say God, again, going back to language, that is they, them,
Right.
divine being, whatever creator. So, I know a lot of people have some stigma that's connected to, I want to make that clear first off. But under this creator, I do feel that it's a twofold question. Again, when we go back to faith being universal and truth being singular, it's really up to us to navigate and find our truth and our pathway. Because that pathway, everything we do resonates throughout the universe, creates ripples, creates effects, moves. And so even the littlest things to us that feel not so important are an appointment. They are something very important. So that's one way. The second way I would say is that there is a level that we may have a higher calling or feel a stronger connection to that calling. And I think that comes over time with karmic destiny and where you're at. It is up to you or your soul to will and to dare. And that's something we learn in the Western Mysteries tradition, to be able to will it and to dare to do it. So yes, overall, but even in the most mundane ways, that is an appointment.
Right. Brilliant. I think we're at time, but if we could ever do a part 2 of this, I'm down. What I would love is for you to describe, if someone's ready to own their own sovereignty, to become empowered, and to do this work with you, where can they go?
So my website is divinevoidsophia.com. My Instagram is at divinevoidsophia. I do have a Patreon. Everything is linked onto my Instagram and on my website. I do have curriculum coming. So everything we talked about, I've molded into a 4-part series. And ultimately, it's it's less about the attunement and more about helping the navigation system.
Mm-hmm.
So, with every teacher that is teaching these attunements or crest or whatever it is, we all have our own filter. And I do feel that mine has a lot to do with understanding the language and the navigation of how this not only lives in the spiritual world, in your etheric sphere, but also in your everyday life. So that should be releasing in March, and all of that information will be on Instagram and on my site.
I'm excited to see it. Thank you so much for returning to the podcast and raining down this wisdom on us. I always enjoy our time together.
Same. I do too.
All right. Hope to see you soon. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.